Orders of the day, order du jour.
Government orders. Government bills. Commons, resuming debate at second reading of Bill C-25, pooled registered pension plans.
Il y a 5 minutes pour les questions et commentaires.
5 minutes remaining for questions and comments for the Honourable Member for Les Salamard. Questions and comments.
Resuming debate. Reprise du débat. The Honourable Member for Vancouver East.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise in the House today and have an opportunity to speak on Bill C-25, which is the pooled registered pension plans. And I want to begin by just commenting on the remarks that were made by the Minister of State for Finance. I heard him during the debate earlier this morning and again in question period in response to one of his own members' questions on this bill, and aren't they doing a great job on pensions and helping seniors? I was really surprised to hear the Minister of State say that this plan that they have, Bill C-25, will be accessible. And he kept on stressing that it will be accessible. Well, Mr. Speaker, when you look at the bill and you look at the proposal they have, there's absolutely nothing accessible about it. How can something be accessible when you can't afford it? How can something be accessible when basically to go ahead with this kind of savings scheme would be to put your money at risk in very volatile markets? And how can it be accessible to the 1.6 million seniors who are considered to be living in poverty as estimated by the Canadian Labour Congress? So, Mr. Speaker, I was very surprised to see them describe this proposal as something that is actually accessible. I was further surprised when the Minister of State remarked that currently in the RRSP plan, there's, I think he said, $600 billion room for people to make contributions under RRSPs. And he said, well, here this is a great opportunity to do this. But surely that begs the question as to why Canadians are not taking up what already exists under RRSPs if there's $600 billion tax room available that they could use individually. Well, clearly the answer is because most Canadians, A, can't afford to make RRSPs, or if they can, they're very concerned about the security of their money, whether it's in various kinds of stocks or mutual funds and so on. And so they haven't been taking up that so-called room in RRSPs. So I did want to make a comment on that to begin with, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader is rising up.
Thank you, and I apologize my colleague for interrupting. It's not a point of order on her presentation, but just to correct the record, Mr. Speaker, going back to routine proceedings and questions on the order paper, questions 403, 404 were included in my submission, as well as 402 and 405.
Thank the Honourable Member for that clarification. The Honourable Member for Vancouver East.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll continue with my remarks on C-25. I do want to make it clear, Mr. Speaker, that this so-called pooled registered pension plan does not guarantee an actual pension. So let's be very clear about that. There's also no guarantees of how much your money would be left when you retire if you had been able to afford to put money into such a plan. And I think as we read through the legislation, it becomes very clear that the risks of such a plan are borne entirely by the individual who's making the contribution, as well as the employer if they decided to make a contribution. We should also be aware that this so-called pension plan that has, quote, accessibility will be managed by for-profit financial institutions like banks, insurance companies and trust companies. There'll be no caps on administration fees or costs. And so I think we have to be very clear that this so-called plan, which is no plan at all from the Conservative government, is basically pushing people into the marketplace and saying, well, if you can afford it, go fend for yourself. That's the basis of their plan here today, Mr. Speaker. We should be very clear that this proposal does not require matching contributions from employers. And what it is really doing is encouraging hardworking Canadians to basically gamble on failing stock markets. Now, I find it really quite incredible that on a basis of public policy, we would have a government who comes forward with this proposal and says, well, this is our answer to the severe pension problems that we have. We're going to just shuffle everybody off and say, well, go in the marketplace and see if it will fix it for you. Well, Mr. Speaker, we know that that's clearly not the case. And for anybody who watched their RSPs plummet over the past year or so, they know how risky it is to have your savings tied to the stock market and how risky that is for your retirement. Now, Mr. Speaker, I also want to illuminate on the bigger picture, and that is, you know, we heard the Prime Minister in Davos, Switzerland, just last Thursday, and we heard his speech about what he mentioned several times, a fix for a generation. Well, I would say it's more like a rip-off for generations to come. And of course, one of the cores of that speech was his musings about how they're going to now tackle something that's very basic to Canadians, and that's our old age security system. And I find it quite reprehensible that we have a government that has very clear choices that it could make about economic performance, about where how tax revenue is collected and where tax revenue goes, and yet we have a government that's made a very clear choice and in fact had the gall to announce those choices in Switzerland to a bunch of billionaires. They didn't even have the guts to be in Canada to roll out what their plan was. They didn't have the guts to say it in the election. And so here we have a government, we learn from the Davos speech, the fix it for in a generation speech, that the government now plans to take aim at the old age security system and our pension system. And of course, I think the opening shot is the proposal that we have here today. Now, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that by contrast, the NDP has done an enormous amount of work on studying, researching, and analysing what does need to be done to ensure pension security for Canadians who are already in retirement or Canadians who are planning to retire and approaching that age. And I want to pay tribute and to thank the member from Hamilton East Stony Creek for the amazing work that he's done in bringing this issue forward. He has very doggedly, time after time, whether it's in question period, whether it's in bills that he's proposed for the NDP and brought forward in the House, whether it's the forums that he's held across the country in speaking with seniors organizations, he has made it very clear on our behalf, and something that we all support, that the NDP has brought forward a very comprehensive plan for retirement income security. We wouldn't leave people out in the cold. We wouldn't leave people to the vagaries of the marketplace. We wouldn't say to people, well, you know, you might have to get a bit older, several years older, before you can collect your old age security. Our plan is based on income retirement security that is fair, that is equitable, and most importantly, is affordable. And as the member outlined earlier this morning, is a plan that would increase the plan that works in this country, and that's the Canada pension plan and the Quebec pension plan, and we would increase that to a maximum of $1,920 a month. And we would ensure that it actually is sustainable, and we would ensure that Canadians are then actually getting a fair and decent pension retirement. We would also, Mr. Speaker, amend the bankruptcy legislation to make sure that pensioners and long-term disability recipients are at the front of the line, not the end of the line, of creditors when their employers enter court protection to declare bankruptcy. And how many cases have we heard in this House of seniors who have, over the years, worked really hard, paid into their pension plan, only to see it go up in smoke because of bankruptcy proceedings, and to find out that they were at the very bottom when it came to seeing some justice from the system such as it exists now. So we've put forward legislation to correct that situation. And finally, Mr. Speaker, we've made it very clear that we would increase the guaranteed income supplement, what's called the GIS, to a sufficient level, about $700 million a year, to lift every senior out of poverty in Canada immediately. And again, this is something that is affordable, it is realistic, and it's the right kind of public policy decision to make in this country at this time. So, Mr. Speaker, in debating this legislation, today, I think we have to be very clear that we have a Conservative government that likes to make announcements in front of its billionaire elite supporters in Davos, Switzerland. They like to put forward proposals that is driving people into a marketplace situation and saying, well, go out there and fend for yourself. And, you know, if your savings get wrapped up in some kind of volatile market and you lose it all, well, that's not our problem. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that's not our approach. We don't want to see income inequality grow in this country. What was announced at Davos was nothing more than a further sap to huge corporate interests, such as we've seen with the corporate tax cuts. And I think we have to be very clear for Canadians that there is an alternative, that we don't have to be driven by this kind of agenda. And I hope that this bill today, C-25, is the beginning of a massive campaign to show that Canadians will not allow their pension system to be tampered with. You know, other prime ministers have tried to do this. Other Liberal, Conservative prime ministers tried to get in there and say, oh, well, we're going to make changes. And they heard the wrath of Canadian seniors who are a very organized group. So I hope today that, that this bill will be the first opportunity to mount a campaign as to what we see as an attack on public services, on our public pension system, on seniors, on the most vulnerable in our society. We have to say no to this idea that it's just about the marketplace, and we have to say yes to sound public policy decisions that are fair and equitable and affordable, and that's what the NDP has put forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Fort McMurray Athabasca.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm wondering, the member easily criticizes the government in relation to what our proposed plan is or what she expects it to be, but I'm curious as to what their plan would be. Now, we've seen the NDP continuously suggest spending and spending and more spending, billions upon billions of dollars, and I'm wondering, first of all, where that money is going to come from, because sooner or later it has to come from somewhere and somebody has to pay the bill, and what her suggestion would be relating to the large demographic we are having. Mr. Speaker, it looks like that by 2030 there will be 3 times the expense, yearly expense, for these programs, and what is her party coming forward with proposals for in this regard? Spending more money? Well, sooner or later somebody has to pay for it, Mr. Speaker, and I'm wondering who's going to pay for that.
Carbon tax or something.
The honourable member for Vancouver East.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd actually be very happy to answer that question because it gives me an opportunity to bring forward very solid information about how the NDP has proposed that we pay for something like raising the GIS. Let's begin with January 1, 2012. This year alone, we'll see a corporate tax cut of $3 billion. We're now, I forget what the number is, we're over $60 billion, I think, since 2004 of corporate tax cuts. So the loss of public revenue that they have perpetuated and brought forward is driving their agenda for saying, well, now we've got to have cuts. We know that it is about looking at the pie overall and looking where your revenue comes from and where your expenditure goes. So, Mr. Speaker, all of the proposals that the NDP has made for pension reform that would produce better equitability and access and fairness is based on an affordability and an ability to pay. So let's say right at the start that our tax system should be based on ability to pay. It should be progressive. And this idea that you can just shave off the top and say, well, you guys, the bigger you are, the less you have to pay. That is wrong. And that's what's robbing our system and driving these cuts. And we have to stand up to that, I think, as Canadians will, and to say that that's completely unacceptable.
Questions and comments? L'honorable député.
The Honourable Member for La Salle-Marde. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Honourable, my colleague, the member for Vancouver East. I also know of her social democratic beliefs, and she really gave a speech that describes very well the contempt with regard to what we're facing here. I'd like her to talk a little bit more about the current situation for women, in particular women who have reached the golden age, if you will, and the current situation facing women at the present time here.
Member for Vancouver East.
Well, I thank my colleague for her comments, and there's no question that women face a disproportionate share of living below the poverty line. Many women have worked in this country, but they haven't necessarily contributed to the Canada Pension Plan. So the whole issue of unpaid work or wages is something that's very, very big, and there's a huge gender difference in terms of income equality in this country. So again, when we have a proposal from the government that's just really pie in the sky in terms of saying to people, well, go out and have a ball, invest all this money in stocks and your own plan. I mean, it's completely missing the point of the tens of thousands of women in this country who actually survive based on old age security and the guaranteed income supplement, and maybe if they made contributions to the Canada Pension Plan. So the idea that there's any kind of gender analysis of this legislation, I mean, even the previous Liberal government supposedly said that there should be gender analysis of legislation, although they really didn't seem to live up to that. But now that kind of thing's gone completely by the boards. But I mean, it really requires that kind of examination, because I think it would then show that seniors who are women are having a much more difficult time. And it brings me back to the point, Mr. Speaker, that it's just so reprehensible that we have a Prime Minister at this conference in Switzerland who's musing about this big agenda he's got that I think most people find incredibly scary. And I think our job here is to make sure he doesn't get away with it.
Resuming debate.